quiet English morning cracked open like thin glass when a father stepped inside a lonely farmhouse, unaware that 6 masked men were already there, hidden, waiting, and ready to turn an ordinary day into a family's lifelong nightmare. Before anyone could stop the cascade of events, a debt turned into a trap, a farm became a prison, and an operation planned by a feared crime boss would leave scars that took nearly 20 years to close. This is the story of Brian Waters, a father targeted, a family terrorized, and an investigation that stretched across continents to finally bring the truth to light. Brian Waters began the morning of June 19, 2003, the way he often did, carrying the quiet burdens that life had handed him, but still managing to move through the world like a man trying to keep peace in his home. Once a hard-working construction laborer, he had been pushed off his path after injuries forced him out of steady employment. The weight of bills, responsibilities, and the pressure to provide nudged him toward a small cannabis cultivation setup at Burnt House Farm, a remote, aging property tucked away in rural Cheshire. For Brian, the farm was not a criminal empire, it was a desperate attempt to hold his family above water. What he didn't realize was that this fragile decision would intersect with a man who saw everything through the lens of control and retaliation, John Wilson. Known to law enforcement as a manipulative figure within the local criminal underworld, Wilson believed Brian owed him £20,000, a debt that may have grown more out of intimidation and ego than actual business dealings. But with Wilson, perception was power. And in his eyes, Brian had crossed a line. While Brian drove toward Burnt House Farm that morning, 6 men were already inside. Their faces were hidden, their movements silent, their purpose aligned with Wilson's rigid sense of dominance. They were not there to talk, reason, or negotiate. They were there to send a message. As Brian stepped into the dim interior of the building, the ambush unfolded swiftly. The men overpowered him, taking control with a level of coordination that showed this operation had been rehearsed long before the day arrived. Brian's family at home sensed nothing. His wife was already accustomed to the ebb and flow of his unpredictable workdays, and his adult children were busy with their own routines. But as the hours passed and Brian's silence grew heavier, a quiet thread of worry began stitching itself into panic. His son and daughter eventually felt compelled to go check on him, an ordinary, loving instinct that fate twisted into something cruel. When they arrived at the farm, they walked directly into the hands of the same masked men. In moments, they were restrained and forced into a terrifying situation far beyond anything they could have imagined. Trial testimonies would later describe how the attackers kept control with calculated intimidation, ensuring that Brian's family remained powerless and emotionally overwhelmed. This was not spontaneous violence. This was a strategically designed punishment meant to break Brian while ensuring his family could do nothing but watch. Inside the confines of Burnt House Farm, time seemed to stretch endlessly. For the attackers, it was routine. For the family, it was a nightmare that refused to end. Every passing moment intensified the terror, and every attempt to understand what was happening only deepened their horror. Brian's mistakes, debts, and difficult choices had guided him to the farm that day, but his family had been dragged in simply because they loved him enough to check on his silence. During the ordeal, a narrow window of hope appeared. It was small, unpredictable, and arrived not because the attackers faltered intentionally, but because even the most organized operations cannot remain airtight forever. One of Brian's children managed to break free just enough to escape the building. In a state of shock, they ran toward the road, flagging down help from strangers who could barely comprehend the panic unfolding in front of them. A call to emergency services was made, and police units raced to the farm. Officers entered Burnt House Farm to find devastation, signs of prolonged torment, and a scene that made one thing painfully obvious. This had not been random. The attackers were gone. The chaos they left behind told investigators that this crime had been planned, carried out with precision, and executed under the direction of someone who believed he was untouchable. The case shocked the country. News reports spoke of it as one of the darkest investigations Cheshire police had ever taken on, not because details were sensational, but because the bare facts alone struck at the core of every family's worst fear. A father had been attacked in a calculated criminal act, his family had been forced into a state of helpless terror, and those behind it had operated with the cruel confidence of people who believed they would never face consequences. Very quickly, one name began rising to the surface: John Wilson. Although he was not physically present at the scene, investigators suspected he was the architect of the entire operation. Wilson's influence, his connections, and his history of intimidating those he considered indebted to him made him the prime suspect almost immediately. What followed was not a quick case nor a straightforward pursuit. Cheshire police launched one of the largest manhunts in regional history, involving surveillance teams, informants, cross-border coordination, and years of patient investigative work. Some suspects were caught early, others vanished, reinventing themselves under new names in different cities, but the detectives refused to let the case go cold. Every lead was followed, every file was revisited, every whispered rumor about Wilson's network was examined. What slowly emerged was a picture of a criminal ecosystem built on fear, loyalty, and manipulation, and the attack on Brian Waters was one of its most extreme consequences. By the time the first arrests were made, investigators understood they were not just solving a single tragedy, they were dismantling a criminal structure built on intimidation. Brian's family, though traumatized, remained determined to see justice done. Their resilience became one of the driving forces behind a case that would take nearly 2 decades to finally unravel completely. A case that began with a father walking into a farm and ended with a courtroom full of answers that had taken far too long to surface.
The investigation into the murder of Brian Waters began under the weight of shock and urgency. Cheshire police, confronted with a case that blended organized crime, family trauma, and a uniquely calculated act of violence, understood immediately that this would not be solved quickly. Officers worked through Burnt House Farm with a forensic precision that mirrored the attacker's chilling organization, gathering every trace that could eventually point toward those responsible. Despite the devastation left behind, the attackers had made mistakes. They believed their masks and distance would protect them. They believed fear would silence witnesses. What they didn't anticipate was how determined the surviving family would be to stand firm, or how tirelessly investigators would pursue the truth. The first wave of clues came from the smallest details: footprints, fibers, abandoned equipment, and the fragments of items the attackers had brought with them. Detectives quickly realized the operation had been planned days, possibly weeks in advance. There were signs of surveillance on Brian, notes indicating observation schedules, routes studied, and vulnerabilities assessed. These were not impulsive criminals. They were followers of a man who saw people as pieces on a board: John Wilson. Within days, Wilson's name quietly moved to the top of the suspect list. He denied everything, publicly and privately, portraying himself as an innocent man wrongly accused. But detectives already knew that Wilson rarely dirtied his own hands. He controlled others, manipulated them, demanded loyalty, and used threats like levers to push people into doing what he wanted. Tracking down the 6 attackers became the investigation's central mission. Some had fled almost immediately after the crime. Others blended into familiar neighborhoods, confident that if they simply kept their heads down, the case would fade like so many unsolved tragedies. But this case refused to fade. Police began piecing together financial transactions, burner phone records, and statements from individuals who had once feared Wilson too much to speak. Surveillance teams shadowed associates who, under stress, slipped up and provided small but vital information. One suspect was traced to a northern city where he had been living under a false name, working quiet jobs, trying to disappear. Another fled abroad, believing distance would blur his connection to the crime. But investigators were patient. They allowed time to work in their favor, letting the suspects feel safe enough to make mistakes. While police traced the attackers, Wilson played a cold, calculated game. He denied involvement at every turn, even as evidence slowly closed in around him. Interviews revealed his meticulous personality, a man who believed control was his birthright. But his confidence wavered when detectives uncovered records tying him to individuals present at Burt House Farm. They found messages, carefully disguised but clear in intention. They discovered witnesses who had overheard Wilson speak about debts, disobedience, and the consequences he believed were necessary. Bit by bit, his mask cracked. The first major breakthrough came when one of the attackers, overwhelmed by fear of being hunted, made contact with an associate. That associate's conversation, recorded through existing surveillance, gave police their first concrete link between the farm and Wilson's inner circle. Suddenly, the case accelerated. Arrest warrants were prepared. Search teams moved in. Within a short span, several men connected to the operation were in custody. Their stories were inconsistent, their alibis frayed, and their attempts to protect Wilson collapsed under the weight of cross-examination. Some claimed they had been mislighted. Others insisted they had not known the full extent of Wilson's plan. But the patterns were undeniable. Wilson was the architect. Wilson himself fled for a time, moving between addresses, hiding in properties under false names, relying on contacts who owed him favors. But the pressure grew unbearable. International agencies became involved as rumors placed him in Ireland, then Spain, then back in the UK. Eventually, Wilson was located and arrested. His capture marked a turning point, the moment where fear began to shift from the family onto the man who had inflicted so much harm. The court proceedings that followed were long, complex, and emotionally draining for the Waters family, but they were also a testament to persistence. Prosecutors laid out the timeline of the planning, the manipulation, and the leadership Wilson had exercised over the attackers. Witness after witness came forward, some reluctantly, some trembling, describing how Wilson's influence controlled people through fear. The attackers attempted to distance themselves from him, but their stories contradicted one another. A network built on secrecy began breaking under the bright, unforgiving light of the courtroom. Finally, the verdicts arrived. Wilson was convicted, receiving a life sentence. Several of the attackers also faced life imprisonment. The courtroom was heavy that day, not with celebration, but with the quiet release of breath a family had been holding for years. Justice did not erase trauma, but it delivered something essential: acknowledgement. The world now knew what had been done, who had done it, and how fiercely a family and a police force had fought to reveal the truth. Nearly 20 years after that horrific day, the last remaining fugitive was captured and brought to trial. His arrest closed the final chapter of a case that had stretched across generations. For the Waters family, the ache would never fully disappear, but they stood tall knowing that persistence and courage had outmatched fear and cruelty. And for investigators, the case became a reminder that time does not protect the guilty. It simply gives the patient an advantage. This story remains one of the UK's most chilling and complex true crime cases, not only because of what happened inside Burnt House Farm, but because of the extraordinary determination that finally brought every responsible person to justice.